Hey guys, so I've been having a bit of a hyperfixation on this series since I read the prequel a few months ago, which was sparked back up by the movie's release. I decided to go back and reread the original series, as the last time I actually read it was maybe a year or two before the first movie even came out, so well over a decade ago. There's a lot more differences than I remembered, but the one I want to discuss here is how disability is essentially eliminated from the movies. So let's just get into it. So before I continue, this video will have spoilers for all three books, but I will not be talking about the prequel. There will also be timestamps for each character if you want to skip around. So I used to rewatch the movies a lot after a decade of not having read the books. There were always two main things that I remembered being changed that I would be upset by. One, the removal of Madge as a character, which annoys me, so I had to mention it, but it will not be discussed here. And two, the omission of Peeta's prosthetic leg. There were actually, in fact, a plethora of disabled characters removed, however, or watered down. Some of these choices I think were understandable, and I'll delve into why later, but to me the majority of the changes in this area felt like an attempt to soften the cruelty and struggles within the book. This video does not exist to say the movies were horrible adaptations, nor to imply that Suzanne Collins, who also wrote the screenplay, doesn't value her disabled characters. But the specific choices made around what was removed or changed from book to movie do generally make sense to me and a lot of people, with the exception of Madge, and the removal of every disabled character in the series. In the book, the injury given to Peeta's leg early on by Cato becomes severely infected and results in blood poisoning. Katniss risks her life to go get him medicine, and while it saves his life and stops the blood poisoning, Peeta's leg is not actually healed and still remains weak and severely injured. After being returned to the capital, Katniss doesn't get to see Peeta again until they meet on stage with Caesar Flickerman for an interview, where she's told that even capital medicine couldn't save his leg. Despite being on stage, she cries, and Caesar gives her a moment to collect herself. I won't say that Peeta is handled perfectly after this point. I do think that most of Catching Fire, and especially Mockingjay, tend to forget this aspect of him, though there is a line during the Quarter Quell where she notes that Peeta is unable to run quickly due to his prosthetic. However, despite his disability serving more to be symbolic of the damage and trauma of the games, one which cannot be resolved with the money and fame thrown at victors, it's still removed from the movies, with it being healed by the Capitol and never addressed again. I can't see how this could have been done to maintain a PG-13 rating or to lessen anything graphic, as all these scenes that include gore or his infliction generally remain the same, and it's only the consequences of that experience that are removed. To be completely honest, I have suspicions on why everything else in this video was changed, but I cannot seem to find a good reason, except for unfortunately the one I'll address at the end, for why Peeta didn't maintain his prosthetic. It's already a noticeably small aspect beyond what they did actually include, and clearly after the first movie, it wouldn't have been a big chunk of their budget. Part of me wonders if it was to avoid backlash of casting an able-bodied actor to play an amputee character, but even now, unfortunately, that's very rare to see actually taken as a serious concern, let alone during the 2010s. I don't really have a full conclusion on the reasoning behind this, but I'd like to believe that it's not due to simply undervaluing disabled characters or viewing it as unimportant, and due to Collins writing the screenplay herself, I do doubt that to be the case, at least fully. Moving on from Peeta, though, the next thing removed is Katniss's hearing loss. During the 74th Hunger Games, in both the book and the movie, Katniss and Rue blow up the food supply of the career tributes. While in the movie this scene is significantly closer to the end of the games, the book has a large portion of them where Katniss suffers complete hearing loss in her left ear and temporary hearing loss in her right ear as a result of the explosion. Due to the book being from Katniss's perspective, we see her go through the hope that she'll regain the hearing and eventually concluding that she won't, her fear around not being able to hunt properly anymore, frustration that despite hiding extremely close to the careers, she cannot hear what they're saying, and a host of both grief and anxiety around this loss. Unlike with Peeta, due to it being from her perspective, we repeatedly see how this impacts her and her learning to manage in the arena with partial hearing loss. Even small lines about Peeta whispering something and her having to adjust how she's sitting to be able to hear him, and not telling him until much later in the games. Unlike with Peeta, when she goes to the Capitol, she's given something that I presume to be akin to a hearing aid, and in the second book she even claims that due to it she can hear the arena force field when others can't. Also, she can't actually, she just doesn't want the game makers to be aware that she was taught how to detect it. Despite this being a prominent obstacle, both in terms of her emotional state and survival, the movie does not retain any of this, and plays a somewhat muffled audio along with a ringing sound for a few seconds after the explosion, but nothing else. This is one aspect of the book that I do somewhat understand its removal, but that being said, I don't actually think it was necessary, I just understand it more. Due to the book being first person, it's much easier to portray how this affects Katniss, and a lot of the struggle for her is mental. She experiences a form of grief, believing that even if she wins, she won't be able to hunt whenever she gets back to 12. She has a pretty understandable anxiety around not being able to pick up on her surroundings as well, fearing that she may not hear another tribute and be killed. There's also an aspect that since she only loses hearing in one ear, the creative choice around audio would be more than likely perceived as bad audio mixing rather than a representation of injury if they were to have gone that route. All that said, I do think that there could have been choices made to show this as part of her character. While there'd be no reason to verbally communicate this till she tells Peeta, in the book her ear bleeds and many of the actions that she takes to protect herself could pretty easily be inferred as her having suffered some form of hearing loss, and would be confirmed later by her telling Peeta, which does happen in the books, and subsequently getting the hearing aid from the Capitol. It doesn't need to be as obvious as it was from her perspective, but it also feels a bit lazy to avoid it altogether. The last major character that I want to discuss is Haymitch and his alcoholism. In the books, Haymitch is much more of an actual alcoholic. On his first appearance in the series, he harasses Effie and falls off the stage due to being drunk at the reaping. Later, when in the train cars on the way to the Capitol, he is incoherently drunk and throws up on himself with Peeta offering to clean him up and him going to bed after. He repeatedly experiences panic or anger over the idea of being deprived of alcohol, and at one point even experiences very severe withdrawal symptoms, to which Katniss gets him liquor and states that she'll never let him go without it again so that they don't have to deal with that. In District 13, alcohol is banned and he's sent to a rehab program for a significant amount of time and is deemed quote-unquote unfit for the public. His sobriety is commented on as he says it looks as bad as it feels about it, and as a recovering alcoholic that is kind of hilariously relatable, if not kind of fucked up. In the movie, Haymitch is generally just disgruntled and unserious. Honestly, this seems more like how they constantly use him as a parallel to Katniss than actually anything to do with his alcoholism. While book Haymitch is definitely more realistic and his addiction is much more damaging, he is the one area where I think that this was actually the right choice made. Books generally include more detail than the movie adaptations, and I think that the consequence of this was that Haymitch overall was just simply not as big of a focus. So that would leave a lot of his screen time to being incoherently drunk and hindered the plot progression quite a bit. As well as, let's be honest, movie adaptations do generally try and make characters more palatable and likable, and a character who sexually harasses Effie as his introduction and throws up on himself in the first, 2 chapters is not the best introduction of a character that we're not meant to be hating. The last little note is 2 background characters. Greasy Say's daughter is explained to have some kind of mental handicap, and while she as a character is extremely unimportant, the way that Katniss perceives her does give some perspective on how disability in general is viewed in 12. And the boy from 10, who is never given a name, is described to have a quote-unquote lame foot. I don't think removing these characters was particularly problematic, as they served more to show how Katniss thought of their situation than to function as independent characters. Obviously, since the book is from Katniss's perspective, their main purpose is kind of fulfilled by how she thinks about them and their situation. While in the movie, their purpose for kind of existing as characters would not really be able to be fulfilled, considering that we can't see what Katniss is thinking about them, so they would probably have to be given a much bigger role to actually serve that purpose, which is ultimately a pretty minor piece of world building. I do think it would have been nice to have them there just kind of as a little nod, if anything, but I understand why they weren't seen as a priority, even if it's kind of irritating. Okay, so what's the point of all this other than me spending the last 10 minutes complaining about book to movie changes? Ultimately, I think the point of all these changes was to sanitize the series, both because unfortunately many people view disability in itself as graphic or an inappropriate topic, but also because a series about a class divide and revolution by an at least center-left author may receive more of a response than a corporation like Lionsgate is comfortable with. The Hunger Games are ultimately a story about the consequences and choices made in war, about class divide and poverty, and about damage caused by fascist and unchecked control. The books do an incredible job of introducing complex topics of ethics and class to teen and young adult audiences, and the disabilities in the books not only serve as representation, but to show how the Capitol and the trauma of the games affects its citizens. So, to be honest, my answer for why they removed Peeta, or ultimately why a lot of this was done, is that it's not palatable. It's not marketable. The irony of the original Hunger Games marketing campaign is enough to show that while the writers of the movie clearly did understand the messages of the book, the corporations funding it were not privy to it. Disabled characters seem to have been more seen as one more graphic or radical aspect to remove from the series, something that would tone it down and make it more palatable to a wider audience. I don't blame Collins for this, but it is honestly very disappointing, and is by no means uncommon in adaptations in general. I'm not really sure how to end this, but that's it. Thanks for watching. Ha det. I stare at the populace in prayer.